Welcome back to the church series, and in the previous video we spoke about the church, the called out ones who are a spiritual building, Jesus himself being the head of that body, and God having called each of us and equipped each of us by giving us spiritual gifts. We function together to build the church of Jesus Christ. Now, when we consider the gifts and the ministries that we have, every one of us has one primary underlying ministry. And it's this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and we read from verse 17. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And then in verse 18, Paul says this, and these things are from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and has given to us the ministry of reconciliation. Every believer in Jesus has as a foundational ministry the ministry of reconciliation. Every other gift that we'll speak of in the coming videos is couched in this one gift of reconciliation. And so whether you're a teacher, it's couched in this ministry of reconciliation, so you have a capacity and ability from God to teach doctrine, but it's couched in this principle of reconciling men to God. Otherwise, your preaching of doctrine can turn you into a Pharisee, where you're simply obsessed with trying to get everything lined up, yet in fact your ministry is not reconciling man to God. So whatever gift you have, whether it's an act of mercy or kindness or hospitality or generosity, everything must be couched in this one gift of reconciliation. Our primary purpose as members of the body is to reconcile man back to God. In other words, he says in verse 19, in Christ God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting the people's trespasses against them, and has given to us the word of reconciliation. So we have the ministry of reconciliation and we have the word of reconciliation. Now, in the book of Ephesians chapter 4, Paul puts it like this, and he says in verse 7, to each one of us, every believer in Jesus, grace was given according to the measure of the gift of Christ. And so every one of us have this spiritual ability, a measure of the gift of Christ. In other words, if you went down to a water source, for example the ocean, and you drew a bucket of water out of the ocean, you simply have a measure of that water source, the ocean. You don't have the whole ocean. Not one person could ever contain that. And so it's the same with every believer in Jesus. We simply have a measure, a portion of the ability of Jesus Christ. That measure will vary from person to person. We see in Matthew 25, the servants given different talents, 1 5, 1 2, and 1 received 1. And so the measure is Christ. The measure will vary in the life of each person. But grace is given according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Then in Romans chapter 12, Paul puts it like this, talking about presenting our bodies as living sacrifices. Verse 3, he says, for by the grace given to me, I say to everyone not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think with sober-mindedness or discernment, as God has distributed to each of you a measure of faith. And so in Christ, as a member of this body, the spiritual building, God has placed within each one of us, firstly, the ministry and the word of reconciliation. And then couched in that could be one of a multiplicity of gifts, which we'll speak to in the next video. But we have with that ministry of reconciliation a measure of the gift of Christ, the grace to go with that measure, and the faith to fulfill that measure. And so every person in Jesus becomes a believer priest. Every one of us has a part and a function within the church. There is no such thing as clergy and laity within the Church of Jesus Christ. Each one of us have been called by God to function in those spiritual abilities that God has imparted to each one of us to build up the Church of Jesus Christ.